Basically, my professional career has been about wildland restoration for the most part. A little bit about bringing that kind of wildland restoration type into urban areas, which is where the pocket prairies come in. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a little bit about prairies in general, and then a little bit about making a little tiny prairie in your yard. So, when you say pocket prairie, this is the image you have most people have had in their head. Is this pretty, flowers everywhere, waving. And that is true for one part of the year. For about 2 months it looks like that. The rest of the year, like that. Grasses are the backbone of prairies. The flowers are important. I didn't know that was going to be loud. Let's go to the next one. The grasses are the backbone of the prairies. The flowers are really important. They're important to function, they're important to habitat, they're important to a lot of things, but the grasses are what's holding everything together. So when you're creating a prairie, we'll get to that in a second. When you're creating a prairie, you're really building a grassland community. And not just above the ground, but below the ground too. It's as much about soil as it is about what's going on above ground. And I want to say it several times, I'll use the word community a lot, because really what you're doing when you're building a prairie, any kind of pocket prairie, is you're building a community. It's not really a garden, it's not an individual set of species, it's a community of many species that need to work together. And so the reason I have this on here, can you see it with the glare? Well, anyway, there's an adorable little girl who's my daughter, she's 13 now, but here, she was about 5, chasing fireflies. And she's chasing fireflies right here, because she's in a pocket prairie in East Austin, and that's the only house that had fireflies on the whole street. And the reason those fireflies are there is because they put in these taller grasses, and they're not this high, they're this high. But there's enough of them that those female fireflies have a place to hide in the grass. They created a functional natural community, and the wildlife came in, and because they did that, we set the stage for her to do that. And so building a pocket prairie isn't just about having some pretty flowers there, it's about sort of invigorating the natural world around you. And prairies are nice because they're little. You can make a little one, you can make a big one. You can have a little bit of nature right in an urban area because they don't need a lot of space. She's mad that I keep showing her because she's big now. Anyway, this is one of my favorite spots at the Wildflower Center. So this is on the pathway down to the family garden. And I like this because it brings together the two pieces of the Wildflower Center. So in the foreground here we have a garden, and it is treated like a garden. It is watered, it's weeded, not really fertilized, but there's a lot of work that goes into keeping it looking like that because it's a garden. And every plant is specifically placed. We decide where every plant goes. In the background, you can see what looks like scorched earth. It is in fact scorched earth because we set it on fire. That is a more natural area, so that is a savanna system. So savanna is just a grassland with scattered trees. So that area back there is managed like a natural area, not like a garden. It's still managed, but we use prescribed fire, we use a little bit of invasive management, so we kill weeds. But we don't water it, we don't irrigate it, we don't fertilize it. We really don't even seed it very often. Periodically, on occasion, if we have extra money, we might throw some seed out there, but for the most part, we don't. But that's the difference between land management and gardening. All interactions with the natural landscape are a conversation between the person and between the landscape. Gardening is more of a lecture. It's more of a one-way thing. The gardener is making all the decisions. In land management, the landscape itself is making a lot of those decisions. And what you're doing in land management is you make a small change and you watch what happens. And then you make another small change and you watch what happens. And the pocket prairies are kind of an intermediate between those two extremes, which is why I like this picture to talk about pocket prairies. So this is a true savanna, really. I'll kind of use them interchangeably, but not really. A true prairie has no trees in it at all. A savanna's got scattered trees. And so this is what Central Texas, most of Central Texas will look like if you come here 200 years ago. So this red grass that you see is called Little Bluestem because it's so blue, it's clearly red. But it's they call it one of the grandfathers of the prairie. And so it's got a root system on it that can go down and out 15 feet, really dense root system. And it can survive long-term drought. Each plant can live for years and years and years. And it's one of the dominants. The cattle like to eat it. And so there's not a ton of it left, but there's still a little bit of it left. But this is what Central Texas sort of prairies would look like. And so in the back, it's not all prairies. In the background, all the hills, that's all woodland, and
What's the name of this grass, please? You said it's red?
It's called little bluestem.
Little blue.
Little bluestem. There's a
And
lot of grasses called bluestem.
Does it look sort of purple at times? Red?
When it first comes out in spring, it's got a kind of a bluish tint to it. But bluestem is just a word that gets applied to lots of grasses. Anyway, this is little bluestem. It's about this big. There's also a big bluestem, which is about this big. And I can get you the scientific name after this if you want. I can't say it, I can write it down. It starts with this. Yeah. Our big bluestem is an andropogon. This is the Zachychirum. This code is SDSE. Anyway, so why are the prairies where they are? Well, so these are the big sort of biomes of North America. Cut off my scope for some reason. But anyway, so over here we've got all the woodlands from the east. This is kind of dry, desert, scrubby. These are the boreal forest up here. And so these patterns are partially explained by water. So it's a lot wetter over here. You get a lot more forest. It's real dry right here. It's wet there. It's partially explained by temperature. It's partially explained by soils. But there's the other piece. There's plenty of water to about here to have pretty dense forests, but we don't have them, or we didn't have them. So why is that? The reason is that this is a disturbance ecology. So the whole middle of the country naturally would burn repeatedly on a short cycle, like every 4 to 12 years or so, any given spot, this spot would have burned. And that's not something bad that's happening with the system, it's actually part of the system, and it's part of what makes it the prairie. And then you can get even smaller into the smaller ecoregions of Texas. We are here kind of on the boundary between the Blackland Prairie to the east and the Edwards Plateau. And so these are both savanna prairie systems, but the Blackland Prairie is more of a true prairie system. You would get the wide expanses with no trees. We always had more trees, that thin rocky soil. But in either place, any given spot is going to flip between different community types. And these are the three that we tend to get. So we'll have savanna with scattered trees. We have woodland where the woodland closes in and you lose the grasses. And then grassland where it's completely open. And what's happening right now on any given spot depends on how much rain you've gotten in the last several years and how frequently the fire and the grazing have happened. But people often ask me, well, what is this spot supposed to be? I'm like, well, it's supposed to be it can be a lot of different things. And there's no one thing that it must be. Most of the spots were mostly prairie, but they also flipped to woodland a lot, and they're all kind of going to woodland now. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just natural systems change, they're dynamic. So to keep prairies prairies, we apply prescribed fire on purpose to add back that disturbance. Because what that does is it keeps the woodies out, it also knocks down the big grasses so that you have chances for the forbs, the flowers to get through, and you get new germination. So they need that every couple of years or they get kind of dead. The other big disturbance is grazing that they would have had. And having that combination, fire and grazing, those two disturbances on top of each other, knocks the diversity up. So you get more and more plants, the more of these disturbances you get, which is kind of counterintuitive, but here you are. The other disturbances these systems are adapted to is drought. We get this a lot. And then the flip side of that is flooding. So this is a disturbance-prone environment. And the communities have adapted to that in a couple of specific ways. So this is one of my favorite pictures. I've got another one over here in color. So this is scale drawings of prairie roots. So the scale on this is 15 feet down. And so what the plants have done is they put most of their resources under the ground where you don't see them. So the prairies are called forest upside down. So everything's going on under the ground. They just put up sort of cheap above ground biomass that they don't care about because they know they're going to lose it. It's going to get set on fire, it's going to get eaten, whatever's going to happen. So they put all of their chips are under the ground. And that's great for us and it's great for water because while they do that, those dense root systems, they put organic matter in the ground every year. So every year some of those roots swap off, you get more organic matter in the ground. And that makes the soil able to absorb water better, it makes it able to clean water better. And over time the soil gets richer and richer. And these root systems really are the foundation for the whole community. And not just an individual root, I'm going to keep talking about diversity. you want a lot of types. So these are all doing different jobs. So these guys are building my soil. This is Liathris, and see how little the plant is in there and how deep these roots go? This is called, so this guy, his job is to get nutrients from really deep in the soil column and bring them back into the surface. So these are all doing different things, and so we need them all, we need a bunch of them to make sure that the community is functioning the way that it should. Now all of that matters to you, because if you're trying to design and grow a prairie, you kind of need to know how these things work. So how do you design one for yourself? The first thing you need to do is observe your surroundings. This is John Hart Asher. He created that prairie that we were looking, that pocket prairie we were looking at before. That's his backyard. And this is why he gets so good at it. He's looking at a mushroom right there. But you need to look at the natural communities around you and take your cue from that as you're trying to create something in your own yard. And the soils. So you need to know what you have. If you're in an urban situation, your soil's probably all mixed up, so you need to be taking soil samples and sending them in. Oh, lost that. So to help you out, this is Texas A&M soil sampling, soil testing lab. If you go to their website, they'll tell you how to take a sample. You send it there. It costs about $50 to get it analyzed, and they'll tell you you want to get the full thing. So you want nutrients, you want texture, and you want organics. You want to know what you have so that you can then design around what you have rather than putting stuff in that doesn't fit what you have and wondering why it don't work. The other thing you do, so this is the web soil survey, which is a digital version of this. This is the soil survey done by the NRCS. So basically, years ago, we surveyed all the soils in all the counties in the United States, but certainly in Texas they did a good job on it. And what's useful about this is you can find your house digitally. You don't have to have this book anymore, all that books. And it'll tell you what soils are expected there. It'll tell you what the capabilities of those soils are. And one of the most useful things if you're thinking about pocket prairie are what's called, in here it's called the range site descriptions. In there it's called the ecological site description. But what it does, you'll find your soil, and then you'll find your range site description, and it will give you a little description. So this one is of the community that goes with that soil, your specific soil. And it'll tell you some of the plants that go there, it'll tell you the plants that show up when it's in bad shape, the plants that show up when it's in good shape, how much bare soil you should have. It's a little primer on your specific soil. And that's an incredibly useful thing when you're first trying to figure this stuff out. So push that button. We don't push it, it's digital. And it's a little hard to use, but there's a tutorial. Fight your way through. The information is worth it.
Is it defined by county?
Yeah, well, this one on the digital is defined by county here. So there's one for each county. And here you actually will draw, you'll find your property and you'll draw a little pixel, you'll draw a little polygon around it, and it'll just give you the report for that. You have to dig down to get to the ecological sites. It's a couple layers down, but it's worth it. Because once you get there, you get basically a species list and you get a nice description. And it's all free. So you've gone through and I forgot to put this in here. This is one of the things that it'll give you. So this is a state change diagram. So inside each of these little boxes is a community that specific soil can support. And then these lines are, it tells you how that community will move between them. And so it'll give you a list of species that go with it. It'll give you a list of activities that encourage it or discourage it. And then it just gives you a good idea of the dynamics of that site. It's one of the only nationwide resources that does that. Most resources just tell you, they describe one community. This one describes all of them. Now it has a bias towards grasslands. This was created to help ranchers with cattle. And so they kind of ignore the woodlands. So you just have to know that going in. But even so, it's still really useful. Now, they can hear a little pocket prairie. So this is an article if you want to a lot of what I'm saying is also in this article. This is the pocket prairie we were in. So Kira, my daughter, was running right over here. We were sitting there looking in this direction. It's not a big lot. It's a tiny little lot. So one of the first things that you're going to need to do, you figure out what your garden is. Then try to figure out what plants you have. And if it's a typical urban backyard, it's probably a bunch of stuff that you don't want to keep. You're probably going to want to start with a clean slate. Not necessarily if you have a bunch of great stuff and keep it, but if you don't, you're probably going to want to start over. There's a couple of ways to do that. This is solarization, and of course it depends on how big your site is. But basically, you stretch plastic over your ground, put water underneath it, and if it just smothers everything that's in there. You want to keep this down for a minimum of 4 weeks, but really you want to keep it down for a year to just start over. If you're like, that's ugly, I hate that, I'm not doing that. There's another method. This is a method. Now this is for starting over. If you have a bunch of great stuff and you don't want to start over, you don't have to do this. But most backyards you want to start over. Anyway, this is another method so that you just put down newspaper or cardboard, and then you put a very thick, like 6 or 8 inch layer of compost on top of that, and that stays down for a year. And I often put mulch on top of it too. And so doing it this way, and then you have to sort of control it. Any green thing that comes up, you pull out of the weed. And this, you get a double whammy, which is nice because you'll smother all the weeds, but you'll also be building your soil at the same time. So those are 2 methods. And then the third, of course, is herbicide, which works to each his own. There's instructions on the bottle. You probably are not going to want to spray your entire garden. You're just hitting individual ones. That's the way to do it. So you've eliminated your weeds. You've got a nice blank slate. Soil preparation is the same as it is for all gardens. You just want loose soil. So you're going to probably till it up a little bit and make it loose down to 4 to 6 inches. If you didn't use the method where you put the compost in over the course of the year, you're probably going to want to add some organic matter, so 1 or 2 inches of good compost. And there are different flavors of compost. So, this is static pile compost. So it means that if you make compost in your backyard, this is probably what you're making. It means you put it in a pile and you ignore it for a year, and then you come back and it kind of looks like dirt. And it smells like the forest floor. So that's the best kind. This is fine wine, well-aged to perfection. This is great for everything. It's also more expensive to buy really nice aged compost, unless you make it yourself, in which case it's not. This other kind, this is called windrow composting, where they make it really fast. So this probably sits in that pile for 6 months to a year. Over there, they make it in a few weeks. And so what they do is they just put all the organic matter in and just turn it. And it starts to break it down, but it's not finished. And you can tell it's not finished because it'll have a bunch of big chunks in it, and it'll look more like mulch than it looks like soil, and it'll smell like ammonia. This is young compost. It's not done. It's not ready. So if you're planting tomorrow, that young compost is going to hurt. It's not going to help you. But the nice thing is the only thing you need to turn this into this is time. So if you're using the method where you're putting down a big layer to kill your weeds, that's fine. You just put it down. A year in, it'll be fine. But if you're planting tomorrow, you need to sprinkle with other stuff. And it's easy to just look at it. It should smell like a forest floor, not a barn. And if it has big chunks in it, it's basically mulch, so you're not going to grow through. Anyway, I put a resource section together, which has got some reputable places that sell good compost. And they'll sell you the wide range. Just tell them I need the good stuff, or I'm happy with the cheap stuff. They'll give you whatever you want. And the reason we like that aged compost is for this. So this is fungus, dirt fungus, mycorrhizae. We like the aged, slow-aged compost because it encourages and allows these guys to grow. And these are one of the things that help those prairie communities survive those intense droughts. So what it does is basically the fungus grows into the root of the plant and it expands its reach. So this little plant up here, its roots end, roots actually end, look at that little shift, right there. You see the little horseshoe? That's its actual roots. Everything else is fungus reaching out. And so what it does is it gives it more, it allows it to get more water, it allows it to get more nutrients. It's a symbiotic relationship. And it's one of the ways that these species can survive in really harsh conditions, is this combination. It's also one of the reasons it can be hard to get late successional native grasses to come up from seed, because the mycorrhizae are missing and they'll just never come up. So, you have prepared your soil, you got some good compost, paid a lot of money for it, maybe not, maybe you made it. Installation, putting the plants in the ground is probably the simplest part of the whole thing. Like preparation is everything, actually getting them in is pretty easy. Now installation is going to be a combination of seed and live plantings, and how much you go either way depends on your budget more than anything else. So with the seed, you can get a higher diversity. With the live plantings, you get something in and alive right away. And the other reason to do some live plantings with the grasses like little bluestone is because they will actually come in with those mycorrhizae and they'll put them into soil. And then they'll start to spread, and so you can help kickstart things. But you can't get all of the plants that you like live. You have to do some seed. Plus, it's just less expensive. There's a lot of tutorials on seeding. Get your seed on the ground, get it in good contact. So you need to rake it in, or you need to roll it, something. It can't be up above, it needs to be touching the ground. And to get seed to germinate, especially native grass seed, you're gonna have to irrigate. I'm sorry to say that. It's not permanent irrigation, but if you want them to come in the year you put them down, you're gonna have to irrigate enough to get them germinated and to get them through the first hump. Unless you happen to be really lucky and it's a wet year, and this is not a wet year. This is why, I'm going to tell everybody why. So this is seed, this is a bean, but all seeds are the same. So they've got food for the plant in there, they've got a hard seed coat and then the embryo, and a bunch of other stuff. That doesn't matter. What matters to us is the seed coat. So the seed coat protects the seed from injury, but it also keeps water out. And it does that, thickness of it determines how long the water stays out. Because when water gets in the middle, that triggers germination. And so it's a kind of elegant system. The seed has to be kept moist for a certain amount of time for it to germinate. So the seed coat slowly starts absorbing water. So it has to stay moist continually for the water to soak into the seed coat starts to swell, and at a certain point the water gets in. But it's like a timer. If it dries out at any point before the water gets all the way through, the seed coat hardens back up, it closes down, you can get no germination. And how long depends, or you just wait. Sorry. How long that is depends on the species, but our grass species are kind of picky because they come down in the middle of droughts a lot, and so they just hang out. So you have to get it long enough to germinate, and then once it germinates, you need to, again, bean seeds just got the better pictures. You need to keep it wet long enough for it to get its root down far enough that the seed will survive. Like the reason that they won't just germinate immediately upon any water is because at first the seed is living on, the plant is living on that seed. It puts down, it germinates, puts down a little root, starts to grow up, but the seed doesn't last long. As soon as that's gone, the plant's living on its own. So if it gets to this point and then everything dries out and its roots are not deep enough to get moisture in the ground, it's going to die. So you may get it to come up and then a day later it's dead. So that first 10 to 20 days, it's critical that the moisture is constant. Not soaking wet, but constant moisture. That's usually why people are not getting any germination that first year. This is in the resource thing that I gave you. This is the amount of water for germinating grass seeds here in Central Texas. But you don't have to remember all that. You just need to know that you need probably 4 or 5 days of constant moist condition. And by moist, I mean if you had this sponge and you got it wet and then you squeezed it out, that level of moisture. Like the soil should feel like a wet sponge that's been squeezed out. So it needs to stay that wet for 5 or 10 days. Watch them, and then when you see the germination, from that point on, you need constant moisture for another 10 days or so. And then after that, you can start backing down. And you can go to, once every 3 days, you give it a little water, and a little bit more. And then after a few months, you get to the point where you're giving it water once a month. And then after the first year, turn off the irrigation. But you want to get it to this point. I mean, you can turn it off every 6 months, but I usually give them a year by year. What plants do you use? Lots of them. I'm not going to give you a seed list today because there's a lot of good resources for that. So the first is this thing that you're all going to look up. The next is we have some really good seed suppliers right here in and around Austin that will help you figure it out. You can tell them, this is where I am. You've done your soil testing, so you know exactly what your soil is, and you can call them and say, this is what I have. Which of your mixes would work best? And they will tell you. So Native American seed, they do all natives. These two, Van Martin and DK, do a mixture of natives and not natives. So if you're interested in natives, you need to tell them that. This is what a seed bag looks like. You can get the mixes, which tend to have a lot of flowers in them, and they also tend to have a lot of grasses. You want a lot of grasses. If the seed mix with all the flowers is too expensive, you can buy individual grass seed. So Texas Brahma, or Cytox Brahma is this one. I said I wasn't gonna. See this guy? That's Cytox Brahma, our state grass. It's a great germinator. And So if you're looking for just something to get you some coverage, buy Cyto's grommets for that, and then would it make sense? But again, just call these people, or go to their websites. They've got ready-made mixes. If you want this, this is your mix. If you want this is your mix. And then if you want to get really geeky on it, you start assembling your own seed mixes, which is what I do, and what I love to do. But for a beginner, I would just go straight to your mixes. And so, in summary, to make it, use a bunch of species. Soil preparation is everything, as is irrigating. Oh, no. Okay, soil prep is everything. You have to irrigate to get them established, I'm sorry. And use a lot of species as managed you can. And then finally, if you want some more resources, this is a little book called The Ecology and Management of Prairies in the Central United States, written by a nature conservancy guy called Chris Helzer. It's a quick read. It's about $35 on Amazon, and it gives you a really nice primer on prairies in general. Just all the dynamics and kind of what you just got really fast, a slower version of that. Anyway, if you want to go deeper, I would buy this book. Yeah.
I have a question on composting.
Yeah.
I pretty much compost all of my oak leaves, and I've been breaking up a lot of cedar needles and stuff. I let it compost for 2 years, I know 2 times, and it breaks down. Like, how nutritious is it?
And the key, I don't know how nutritious oak leaves are specifically, but the key is just to put a lot of organic. I mean, it'll eventually break down to basically carbon and a few other things. I wouldn't compost only oak leaves. Make sure you're putting other stuff in
Now, I
there.
mean, I grow the coffee grounds and tea grounds, but I don't, because I
Yeah,
have
I'm not sure if
stuff, I
they're,
don't get a lot
I'm
of
not
it.
sure about oak leaves specifically, but if you're, the key with compost is time and a lot of sources of organics. And so you're already doing the right thing, like keeping them in there for 2 years to break down all that lignin. Yeah, sorry, I don't know exactly the nutrition of them.
Do you have any suggestions on, you showed the example of a backyard pocket prairie. Are there any minimum sizes at which you can develop a diverse community?
There really isn't, not with the prairies, which is what's nice. I mean, so a little blue stem individual grass is about that big. So you need to be able to fit the grasses in, but that one that we were looking at, it looks bigger than it is in the pictures. It's probably from here to there is the prairie. So you don't need a lot of space. Bigger is better, but start small, definitely start small, and then get bigger.
And if you have one established for a long time, do you need to have that disruptive?
Yes, and so I didn't really go into maintenance, but yeah, you have to be the fire and buffalo. So you're probably not setting your place on fire. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it, but so you do actually have to mow, and then because you're not a fire, mowing leaves thatch. So periodically, every few years, you need to get that thatch out, which you should break the thatch out of the ground and mow. And I like to periodically, after I do that, add a little bit more seed, just a little bit each year, just to hope that it'll keep building over time. And then there's a lot of managing weeds. They're going to be constantly, especially in a small one, they'll be coming in from the edges always. So your biggest maintenance is getting stuff out that you don't want there.
And is there a key time of year that you should start the pocket prairie?
Yes, I should have mentioned that. So the seeding times for us, there's a spring and a fall, and it's really important that you hit them. So in the spring, so if you're putting in flowers, you really should do it in the fall. By fall, I mean October, basically. That's when we get our big rainfalls. You want to have your seed in just before the big rainfalls if it comes. So in October, get them in. There's also a spring one, and spring is late February to early March. That's spring. May is summer. Don't plant them, it's too late. Don't plant at all in the summer if you can help it. You can live plant to a certain extent, but they're not going to be happy. So the best thing you can do is get them early in the spring or in October. It's the best time. And then hopefully you get a little rain and you don't have to irrigate so much. But if it doesn't cooperate, you've got to make the rain. So.
And then can you talk about how from germination and establishment to that full root zone structure that's deep, I mean, is that a 10-year process?
No, it's, I mean, at most a year, and really it's less. I just like to give them a year of support once a month, but they'll be pretty well developed at that point. really at 6 months, they're pretty good.
And so have you done any research around the potential for carbon capture from prairie?
I haven't, I have read a lot of it there, and they do capture quite a bit under the ground, which is nice. But I don't have the numbers. They're not as good as like a peat bog or a wetland, but they're pretty good. Well, we're actually pretty close to deciduous forest. So deciduous forest, they hold about the same amount under the ground that deciduous forest hold above the ground. But it depends on where you are in the depth. There's a capacity issue. So if the soil depth is this much, it can't hold as much as one that's really deep.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Everybody, I printed out her resource page and put it on the front desk as you leave. Be sure to pick one up if you're interested.